Today I'm going to share 3 progressively more disturbing stories, and at the end of each of them I'm going to share the photo that is famously associated with them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please become a surgeon at the hospital located closest to where the like button lives, and then eventually, when the like button goes in for very minor outpatient surgery, accidentally perform a craniectomy on them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's. Just after midnight on June 17th, 1939, a crowd of people began to form outside of this unremarkable building in Versailles, which is a city in France. The atmosphere in this crowd was electric. They all knew why they were there. They knew what they were about to see. But even still, there was a lot of nervous anticipation. As such, some people were coping with these nerves by drinking alcohol and trying to laugh and have a good time, while others were much more subdued and were trying to be respectful about what they were about to witness. A 1939 article in Le Figaro reported that the crowd's mixed emotions reflected the crowd's mixed emotion with executions, a spectacle that drew both thrill seekers and those curious about justice. Between 1 and 2 o'clock IMM, the doors of this unremarkable building opened up, and a group of men dressed in the same dark uniforms came out and didn't say a word to the crowd. The crowd immediately went silent and began to back away from them. This group of men walked right out in front of this building, and they had lumber and tools with them, and they began constructing this kind of strange wooden structure. The crowd wanted to get up close to see what these guys were doing, but at the same time, they didn't want to get too close, as the crowd formed a sort of half moon around these men. These men that were doing the constructing were moving so seamlessly, like all of them had built this structure dozens of times before, and it was just muscle memory. By about 3 o'clock IM, this structure was built, and they placed this large basket next to the structure. Then these men packed up their tools, and the remaining pieces of lumber turned around and went right back inside the doors into the building and were gone. The New York Times, in a 1939 report, noted that the guillotine's assembly was a grim routine for the execution team, whose precision underscored the state's methodical approach to capital punishment. At this point, the crowd had become quite sizable outside of this building, and they were growing kind of restless because they knew, now that this structure was built, that the next time those doors opened, the show was really going to start. This spectacle they were all there for was about to happen. The crowd all knew that this event couldn't happen if the sun was up, because if the sun was up and the area was well lit, the press would be able to take pictures and film it, and that's not what officials wanted. They wanted this to happen in the darkness. But for whatever reason, things seemed to be getting delayed inside of this building, and so the crowd was just getting more and more restless. People were getting more and more drunk, and they were getting louder and more disruptive and boisterous. Le Mans' 1939 coverage described the crowd's growing impatience, with some attendees shouting insults as delays prolonged their wait, highlighting the event's chaotic atmosphere. Around 4:45 a.m., the sun had come up, and so the press was out in full force with their cameras trained at the doors of this building. The crowd really, at this point, was not actually expecting this event to take place, because at this point, it just seemed totally unlikely. But at 4:50 IEM, those doors swung open, and standing in the threshold was 31-year-old Eugene Weidman, who was a convicted serial killer. His arms were tied behind his back, and the collar of his white shirt had been tucked down inside because they needed his neck to be free and clear because he was about to be beheaded. The 2 guards on either side of Eugene pulled him forward out towards the crowd so the executioners behind him, who were dressed all in black, could filter out and take up positions alongside the guillotine, which is that wooden structure that had been built earlier in the morning. As Eugene was being brought out towards the crowd and everything was getting set up for his execution, the crowd went wild. They were shrieking and howling and laughing and pointing and booing and just generally being completely rambunctious and totally bloodthirsty. A 1939 BBC report noted that the crowd's frenzied behavior shocked onlookers, with some comparing it to a medieval mob, amplifying calls for reform in France's execution practices. Eugene kept his head down. He did not want to look at the crowd, and he did not want to look at the guillotine. Eventually, the 2 guards turned him and walked him directly towards the base of the guillotine, at which point the executioners that had taken up their positions around this device grabbed him and slid him forward so he was on his stomach on top of this wooden platform. The guillotine. They slid him forward until his head poked through this opening at the very far end, at which point his neck was positioned right under this huge blade that was dangling right above him, and his head was positioned over a metal bucket on the ground, which he would be looking directly at. At this point, the crowd was at a fever pitch, and one of the executioners pulled a lever, the blade came soaring down, and it removed his head. His head fell into the bucket, and the executioners pushed his torso into the basket that had been placed out there earlier. Then the executioners and the prison guards gathered up Eugene's body parts and went right back inside of the building, which was a prison. The Guardian reported in 1939 that the execution's public nature, captured by photographers, sparked international outrage as images of the cheering crowd painted France as barbaric. At this point, the crowd was cheering and going wild, and they ran up and began dabbing their scarves and handkerchiefs in Eugene's blood, which was on the ground, as a sort of souvenir from having been at this execution. Because the sun had been out for this entire spectacle, all of this had been captured on film. And so later that day, and for the next couple of days, the headlines all over France were about this bloodthirsty crowd that was cheering as this man was beheaded. And it just overall made France look really, really bad. French leaders decided that from that point forward, they could no longer do any more public executions. So the guillotine would continue to be used for decades beyond this point, but it was all behind closed doors. A 1939 Reuters article detailed the government's swift decision to ban public executions, citing the Weidmann spectacle as a national embarrassment that necessitated immediate reform. Also, random fact about being beheaded by a guillotine, your head, after it's been separated from your body, stays conscious for about 10 to 12 seconds, so they say. And apparently, there's been lots of cases where the executioner, after the condemned has had their head removed, will yell the names of the person who has just had their head removed, and that person's head will look over at the person calling to them and will blink or try to mouth words for several seconds before the lack of oxygen kills the brain, and then the head is no longer conscious. Here are some of the more notable pictures that were used in the media from Eugene Weidmann's. In the early 1900s, Eben Byers was a man who other people envied. He was born into a very wealthy family in New York City, attended Yale University in Connecticut, which is a very prestigious Ivy League university, and he was devilishly handsome. After his college graduation, he didn't need a job because his family was so rich, and so instead, he focused his time on a passion of his, which was golfing. In time, he became this world-class golfer, going so far as to win the 1906 U.S. Amateur Tournament, which is the biggest amateur golf tournament in the world, that most of the winners go on to become professional golfers. A 1906 New York Times article praised Byers' victory, noting his exceptional skill and predicting a bright future in professional golf. Eben most likely would have followed that path and become a pro golfer had his father not just handed over the very successful metalworking business that he started that made his family wealthy in the first place. Eben stopped his golf career and became the chairman of this incredibly successful company. And so overnight, he basically went from being just rich to being uber rich, making more money than he could possibly spend. But Eben did attempt to spend his money. He pretty much immediately began buying up luxury properties all over the country. He bought horse racing stables in the United Kingdom and in America. And he bought an entire luxury box at Forbes Field, which is where the Pittsburgh Pirates professional baseball team used to play. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette reported in 1920 that Byers' lavish purchases, including the Forbes Field box, solidified his status as one of America's most extravagant socialites. In addition to owning all these incredible things, Eben also, through his role as chairman of this company, began connecting with and befriending very powerful and influential people, like the founders and executives at the Coca-Cola Company. All in all, Eben's life was really going quite well until 1927. That year, Eben was 47 years old, and he took some time off from gallivanting around the world and rubbing shoulders with famous people to go catch a football game at his alma mater, Yale University. He hops on a train, rides to Connecticut, watches this game, and then afterwards he gets back on the train to head back to Pittsburgh. This is a very long ride. It's over 12 hours long, and so Eben naturally bought a first-class ticket. He was inside of a train car that had bunk beds for passengers to sleep on during the ride. Eben climbed into a top bunk and fell asleep. A few hours later, after the train is well on its way to Pittsburgh, Eben, in his sleep, manages to roll to the side of the bed and actually falls out of his bed onto the ground. He lands hard on his left side. It wakes him up, and as he stands up, he thinks he's okay, but then he feels this shooting pain in his left arm. He's moving his arm around. He's not really sure what's wrong with it, but he's hoping it's just some bruising. He decides to get back into his bunk and just go back to sleep. He manages to fall asleep despite the pain, and then when they roll into the station in Pittsburgh several hours later, he wakes up and right away he feels that pain in his left arm. After getting off the train and going back to his house and dropping off his luggage, he went right to his physical therapist's office to ask him if there was anything he could do to help with the pain in his arm. The physical therapist examines Eben's shoulder and determined that there's no structural damage to his arm, but obviously Eben is in pain. He says, look, there's a new product that came online that's quite expensive, but since you're a man of means, maybe it's something you want to consider. It's called Radithor, and it's supposed to dull aches and pains, and it's supposed to give you this huge boost of energy, so maybe you want to try that. A 1928 Chicago Tribune article advertised Radithor as a miracle cure, touting its radium content as a safe, energy-boosting remedy popular among the elite. Eben was really excited at the notion of taking this new health tonic and said, yeah, let's do it. His physical therapist wrote him a prescription for Radithor. Eben took the prescription, went to the drugstore, picked up a half-ounce bottle of this liquid, went back to his house, and, as prescribed, drank a very small spoonful of this liquid. Right away, he felt a surge of energy. The pain in his arm started to fade. All the things this health tonic claimed to be able to do, it was doing. So over the next couple of days, Eben very diligently every day took the prescribed amount, a very small spoonful of this Radithor, and every day he felt better and better and better. Not just the pain in his arm, but overall he felt happier, he felt fitter, he felt alive, and he was attributing all those feelings to this miracle tonic. He began taking more and more of this tonic well beyond what was prescribed, to the point where he was drinking 3 full bottles of Radithor every single day. For years he did this, and it was all going great until his jaw fell off. Literally. In 1931, one day, his lower jaw just separated from his skull and went slack. The reason this happened was because Radithor was actually just radioactive water. In the early 1900s, the radioactive element radium was believed to have highly curative properties with no side effects. And so naturally, at the time, dozens of health products were created with radium being their main ingredient. And Radithor was one of those products. It was literally just water and radium. After consuming over 1,400 bottles of Radithor over a 3-year period, Eben's body was finally just starting to disintegrate from the inside out. After he had his jaw surgically removed, along with large portions of his upper jaw, the rest of his body also just began to crumble. A 1932 New York Times article detailed Byers' horrific deterioration, sparking a public outcry that led to stricter regulations on radio-based products. By the end of 1931, when his story was making headlines all around the world about the dangers of Radithor and really more specifically the dangers of radium, Eben had become completely bedridden and his skull was now beginning to disintegrate. There were holes forming all over his skull that were exposing portions of his brain. By 1932, Eben was dead. Eben was buried in Pittsburgh, and he was buried inside of a lead-lined coffin that was designed to absorb any of the radiation emitting from his bones. 30 years after he was buried, in 1965, scientists actually exhumed his skeleton to see if it was still emitting radiation, and they determined it was still emitting the same levels of radiation as when he died. They would ultimately figure out that radium, this radioactive element, has a half-life of 1,600 years. So what that means is Eben's body will remain highly radioactive for centuries. A 1965 Pittsburgh Post-Gazette report confirmed the exhumation findings, noting that Byers' case became a cautionary tale in the history of medical quackery. Here is a picture of Eben with his jaw surgically removed. It was taken shortly before he passed away. There is still some debate about what exactly happened in this story that I'm about to share with you, and so for transparency in this video, I'm going to rely on the narrative that was presented in court by the defendant. With that in mind, here we go. On the afternoon of December 3rd, 2012, a freelance photographer working for the New York Post newspaper named Umar Abbasi was walking down the stairs of the 49th Street subway station in New York City. The very busy station is located only a few blocks away from the very famous Times Square. After Umar made his way down to this underground subway station, he walked over to one of the big automated kiosks that looks like an ATM and purchased a subway ticket. With his ticket, he walked over to the turnstiles, slid his ticket through the slot, pushed past the turnstiles, and was now standing out on the actual train platform. From where Umar was standing, this platform basically was like a huge sidewalk that stretched all the way to his right a couple hundred feet and all the way to his left a couple hundred feet. In front of this platform were the actual tracks down below, because the train, when it came out of the tunnel, would actually come right up alongside this platform with almost no clearance between the platform and the train. As such, the leading edge of the platform, basically the lip of the train platform that's closest to the train tracks, has this big yellow line painted all across it to keep commuters from standing too close to the edge, because if a train came through, they could actually get hit by the train. As Umar is standing on this platform and he's looking left and right, it's totally crowded with people and they're all kind of tucked back against the wall away from this yellow line. Umar decides he's going to turn right and wait at the right end of the platform, just because he saw down at the far end there appeared to be a gap in people, and he figured he could stand right there. Umar begins navigating past all of these people on the right side of the platform, and for the most part, everyone he is passing either has their head buried in their phone or they're listening to music, or both, because the thing about riding trains, especially trains in busy cities, is none of the commuters want to talk to anybody else. They want to be completely left alone. As Umar is walking, everyone was basically doing that, but at some point he did pass two people that were engaged in a pretty heated conversation. A 2012 New York Daily News report noted that such altercations were not uncommon in busy subway stations, but this one drew attention due to its escalating intensity. Umar had no idea what they were arguing about, or if they were even arguing at all. He didn't know who these people were, but he took mental note of the fact that two men were kind of bickering with each other. He walked past them, didn't give it much of a second thought, and arrived at a gap in the gaggle of people waiting for the train. And there he just stood, well back of the yellow line, where he pulled out his camera and began clicking through the images he had taken earlier in the day at an earlier photo shoot. As he's clicking through these pictures, he starts to notice that those two men who had been bickering before are now straight up yelling at each other. They're screaming obscenities at each other. It's not clear who's fighting about what or who is the aggressor, but it's very obvious that at this point they're fighting. Umar looked away from his camera and looked left down the platform towards these two guys. These two guys are about 100 to 125 feet away from him, and all the people that were standing in the vicinity of these two men are beginning to migrate away from them. They just don't want anything to do with them. The thing about being in subways, especially in cities like New York, is there's lots of people that go down into these train stations that are inebriated or mentally unstable. And so very strange and bad behavior is just kind of a normal thing, and people tend to just kind of ignore it. That's what's happening. People are kind of walking away from these two fighting men, doing their best to pretend it's not happening. The New York Times reported in 2012 that bystanders' reluctance to intervene reflected a common urban instinct to avoid volatile situations in crowded public spaces. Umar spent a couple more seconds staring down the platform at these two men, but eventually just shrugged and thought, you know what, whatever problems they have, they're not mine. He went back to his camera and continued to click through his pictures when all of a sudden he hears a scream coming from the left side of the platform, but it was not a scream that sounded like it came from either of these two men. Umar looked up from his camera and looked left down the platform, and now he just sees chaos. It's people running away from these two men. People are running to get away from whatever is happening around them. Umar is thinking these men must have come to blows and they're now fighting actively, physically with each other. But when finally the crowd kind of cleared for a second, he saw a woman pointing down at the train tracks right in front of where those two men had been standing. Umar looks at the woman, follows her finger down onto the tracks, and sees there is now a man, one of the two men who had been fighting, lying face down on the train tracks. To Umar's horror, he looks up down the tunnel where the train would come out of, and he sees the headlights of the train. It is now coming into the station. Umar starts running down the platform to try to get to this man to pull him out of the tracks. And as he's running, he pulls out his camera, turns the flash on, holds the shutter down, and aims it at the train conductor to hope the flashing of his camera will alert the train conductor to put on the emergency brake and stop the train before he hits this guy down on the tracks. As Umar is running, trying to signal this train conductor, the man down on the tracks tries to stand up. Umar sees he's really struggling to stand. When he finally gets up, he turns and grabs the edge of the platform and tries to pull himself up and out of the tracks, but he doesn't have the strength or the coordination. As Umar is getting closer and closer, but he's still too far away to help, he sees that this guy down on the tracks is not going to be able to get out of there before the train hits him. Umar finally comes to a stop and watches as this man down on the tracks lets go of the lip of this platform and just turns and faces the train like he knows what's about to happen. Seconds later, the train, although it did try to stop, impacted this man and killed him instantly. A 2012 CNN report described the chaotic scene, noting that the train's speed and proximity left no time for rescue, amplifying the train's speed and proximity left no time for rescue, amplifying the train's speed and proximity left no time for rescue. The man's name was Kisu Khan, and he was 58 years old. When the police finally showed up, they arrested the other man who Han had been fighting with. He was a 30-year-old named Naeem Davis. Davis would actually tell police that he had been fighting with Han and he had pushed him onto the tracks, but it was in self-defense. However, that self-defense story didn't stop him from being charged with murder. While Davis sat in jail waiting for his trial, the media and the public at large had already come to the conclusion that Davis was guilty, and this was due in large part to a particular picture. As Umar was running down the platform, holding up his camera, holding the flash down, trying to flag the train conductor to get him to stop, Umar was also taking dozens and dozens of pictures, and those pictures were of Han right before he was struck by the train. After Umar ultimately discovered he had taken these pictures, he gave them to his employer, the New York Post newspaper, and the day after the incident, they ran on the front page a picture of Han right before he's about to be killed with the headline, "Doomed." Once the public saw this picture, nobody could believe that Davis was anything other than a cold-blooded killer for pushing this poor innocent man onto the tracks. A 2012 New York Daily News article criticized the Post's decision to publish the photo, arguing it sensationalized Han's death and prejudiced public opinion against Davis before the trial. As it would turn out, nearly 5 years later, when Davis did finally get his trial, he was acquitted of all charges because it turned out Han was very drunk, had picked a fight with Davis, and Davis was filmed on more than one occasion on the platform trying to get Han to leave him alone. Finally, after Han began making death threats and then grabbed Davis's shoulder, Davis turned around and pushed him, and Han, being drunk, stumbled and fell backwards onto the tracks and was ultimately killed. The New York Times reported in 2017 that surveillance footage and witness testimonies corroborated Davis's self-defense claim, leading to his acquittal and sparking debates about subway safety. Here is the infamous photo of Han on the cover of the New York Post newspaper. These tales of tragedy and horror leave us haunted, reminding us how fragile life can be. From Weidman's grim fate to Byers' deadly mistake and Han's tragic end, each story carries a weight that lingers. If they stirred you, share them to spark reflection. Stay curious, stay cautious, and until next time, take care.